It all started on a crisp Saturday morning when Emily Patterson, the wealthiest woman in Maplewood Estates, burst into a frenzy. Frantically, she called the police, claiming that her precious diamond necklace, a family heirloom worth a small fortune, had been stolen. But she didn't just stop there. Without a shred of hesitation, Emily pointed fingers at her new neighbors, the Johnson family, accusing them of being the culprits. The Johnsons had only recently moved in, excited to make a fresh start in the neighborhood. They were a quiet family, friendly but reserved, careful not to disturb anyone. They'd gone out of their way to make a good impression, hoping to blend into the Maplewood community. But now, as two squad cars pulled up in front of their modest home, all eyes in the neighborhood were on them. Inside the house, Mr. Johnson watched through the window as police officers walked up the driveway. His wife, Sandra, clutched his arm, her face drained of color, while their teenage son, Jamal, stood nearby, confused and worried. When the officers knocked, Mr. Johnson opened the door, trying to maintain his composure. "Good morning, officers. How can I help you?" he asked, though his voice was tense. "We received a report of a theft," one of the officers replied bluntly. "We have reason to believe there may be stolen property in your home." Sandra's eyes widened. "Stolen property? What are you talking about?" "It was your neighbor, Mrs. Patterson," another officer interjected. "She believes you took her jewelry." The Johnsons exchanged shocked looks. "This is ridiculous," Mr. Johnson said, his tone firm but controlled. "We haven't stolen anything." The officers insisted on searching the home, leaving the Johnsons no choice but to comply. As the officers moved room to room, rifling through drawers and cabinets, the Johnson family could only stand by and watch, their faces a mixture of humiliation and outrage. Outside, neighbors began gathering on the sidewalks, whispering among themselves, some casting judgmental glances at the Johnsons' front door. After what felt like an eternity, the officers returned to the living room empty-handed. "We didn't find anything," one of them finally admitted. Sandra exhaled a shaky breath, her hands clasped tightly together. "We told you. We would never steal from anyone," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. But the damage was done. As the officers left and the whispers outside grew louder, Emily watched from her own front porch, a smug look crossing her face. The Johnsons could sense it. This wasn't the end of it. This accusation was only the beginning of something much darker. The news spread like wildfire through Maplewood Estates. By the next morning, whispers echoed down every street, from the manicured lawns to the coffee shop on the corner. The Johnsons, once greeted with polite smiles and nods, now found themselves the center of stares and hushed conversations. At the center of it all was Emily Patterson. She wasted no time embellishing her story, relishing the attention as she recounted every detail of the alleged theft to her closest neighbors. Over cups of coffee and evening walks, she hinted that the Johnsons had a hidden past and warned everyone that they could be dangerous. "People like them," she'd say in a hushed, dramatic voice, "don't just move into a neighborhood like this without a reason." It wasn't long before Emily's accusations morphed into twisted tales of the Johnsons' criminal history. A few neighbors, either fearing or trusting Emily's story, began to avoid the Johnsons altogether. Some pulled their children away when Jamal walked by. Others stopped waving as they passed by the Johnsons' house. A few even crossed the street to avoid them entirely. Emily's words, filled with subtle yet sharp prejudice, had created a thick barrier around the Johnson family. They could feel the weight of suspicion, and each glance, each closed door, was a reminder that their lives had been upended by a single false accusation. For the Johnson family, the ordeal was a nightmare that seemed to worsen with each passing day. They had always been the kind of neighbors who helped without hesitation, shoveling snowy driveways for the elderly couple next door, hosting a small cookout to welcome newcomers. Now, every gesture of goodwill felt like it had been twisted into something suspicious. Sandra could hardly bring herself to go out anymore, worried about the cold stares and whispers. Jamal, who once biked freely around the neighborhood, kept to himself, feeling the sting of his classmates' taunts and the tension that seemed to follow him. Determined to end the nightmare, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson decided to confront Emily. They walked over to her house one afternoon, hearts pounding, ready to put an end to the rumors. Emily answered the door, her expression cool and unbothered. "Emily," Mr. Johnson began, "we need to talk. This has gone too far. Our son is being treated like a criminal, and we can't even step outside without feeling like we're on trial." Emily crossed her arms, a sly smile tugging at her lips. "Oh, really?" she replied smoothly. "Maybe if you didn't have anything to hide, you wouldn't be so defensive." Sandra's face flushed. "We don't have anything to hide, Emily. You know that. We didn't take anything from you. All we want is for this nonsense to end." But Emily's expression turned icy. "The only reason you want this to end is because you know people are onto you. Maybe it's time you just left Maplewood Estates. After all," she sneered, "we wouldn't want anyone else's things to go missing, would we?" The Johnsons were left standing on her doorstep, stunned and furious. Emily's refusal to back down, her almost gleeful confidence, made it clear that she had no intention of stopping. The lies would continue, and their lives would remain under a dark cloud. The once warm and welcoming Maplewood Estates was now a place of silent suspicion and cold shoulders for the Johnson family. They watched as invitations to neighborhood gatherings stopped appearing in their mailbox, and longtime friends began avoiding their calls. No one wanted to be associated with criminals, and Emily was making sure everyone knew about the danger lurking next door. Emily's stories became more outrageous with each retelling. She no longer simply hinted that the Johnsons were involved in something shady. She painted them as a family with a criminal past, people who had moved in with ulterior motives. She'd tell neighbors that she had heard terrible things about them from a reliable source and warned others to be cautious. Rumors escalated quickly. One story had Sandra working as a criminal mastermind who specialized in scams. Another suggested that Mr. Johnson was a professional thief with connections to a larger ring. Even Jamal wasn't spared. Some parents whispered that he was bad news and told their children to stay away. The Johnsons could feel the walls closing in, each glare from a neighbor like a weight pressing down on them. Simple trips to the grocery store became nerve-wracking, with the constant fear of seeing someone from the neighborhood, knowing they'd be met with that same cold, judgmental stare. They were becoming prisoners in their own home, isolated and unable to stop the lies from spreading. As if the tension couldn't get any worse, Emily claimed to have found new evidence that, in her words, proved the Johnsons' guilt. It happened one morning when Emily called the police once again, this time with a new accusation. She told them that while gardening near the edge of her property, she'd spotted something glinting in the bushes between her yard and the Johnsons' home. Reaching into the shrubbery, she claimed to have pulled out a small, delicate bracelet, one that she insisted had been part of her missing jewelry. The police took the claim seriously and arrived at the Johnsons' house without delay. With neighbors peeking from behind curtains, they informed Mr. and Mrs. Johnson that they were being brought in for questioning. Mr. Johnson's voice shook with anger as he tried to defend his family. "This is ridiculous," he said, holding his ground. "You think we just leave stolen jewelry lying around in plain sight? Someone is trying to frame us." But the police were unconvinced. With evidence supposedly found so close to their property, the Johnsons had little choice but to comply with questioning. Sandra could only cling to her husband, their fear and frustration mounting as they watched the officers scour their home, again searching for items that simply weren't there. As they sat in the police station, answering questions they'd already addressed time and time again, the weight of the situation sank in. They were trapped. Without concrete proof to clear their names, they remained vulnerable to Emily's lies. After their recent questioning, the Johnsons decided they couldn't face this nightmare alone any longer. They hired a lawyer, Marcus Taylor, a sharp, determined attorney with a reputation for standing up against unfair accusations. Marcus took their case to heart, sensing that something was deeply wrong with Emily's claims. From their first meeting, Marcus reassured them, "I believe in your innocence, and we'll do everything to prove it. But this won't be easy. Emily has influence, and her accusations are painting a picture that some people are too quick to believe." The Johnsons, emotionally exhausted but finally feeling a glimmer of hope, put their trust in him. Meanwhile, Emily wasn't sitting idle. Determined to bring the case to trial, She used her connections in the community to spread even more damaging rumors about the Johnson family. At every social gathering, she'd bring up the theft and stoke fear, painting the Johnsons as manipulative criminals who took advantage of everyone's kindness. Emily's theatrics only made things worse for the Johnsons. She would gasp dramatically about the horrible things she supposedly uncovered about the family, claiming they had other victims who were too afraid to come forward. Her words, laced with prejudice, continued to poison the minds of those who'd once been the Johnsons' friends, pushing the case closer to trial. As news of the legal proceedings spread, the neighborhood began to split down the middle. Some families, who had grown to know the Johnsons as genuine and kind people, stood by them, offering words of support and the occasional visit to show solidarity. But they were a small minority in the sea of hostility Emily had created. Most neighbors remained wary, convinced that where there's smoke, there's fire. These residents avoided the Johnsons altogether, taking comfort in their gated homes, content to believe Emily's side of the story without question. When walking past the Johnsons' house, they'd pull their children closer, muttering under their breath about the scandal in the neighborhood. At school, Jamal became the prime target of taunts and whispers. Kids who once played basketball with him during lunch now whispered hurtful things behind his back. He'd hear snide comments like, "Hey, is your family planning to steal anything else? And better watch your pockets around him. He's a Johnson?" Jamal's teachers noticed the shift but seemed powerless to stop it, their own opinions tainted by the community gossip. One day, after another round of cruel jabs from his classmates, Jamal returned home silent, his usually bright demeanor replaced with a heavy sadness. Sandra hugged him close that evening, her heart breaking as he whispered, "Mom, why do they all hate us? We didn't do anything." The Johnsons' once peaceful life had been shattered, and the walls seemed to be closing in even faster. But they held on to one thing, the truth. And with Marcus on their side, they hoped that somehow the truth would come to light, no matter how dark the road ahead seemed. Desperate to clear their name, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson decided to take matters into their own hands. They knew that waiting idly for the trial would only give Emily more time to weave her web of lies, so they started their own investigation. Together, they retraced every detail Emily had shared about the supposed theft, hoping to find cracks in her story. They began by revisiting the timeline Emily claimed, the night the jewelry had allegedly gone missing. They spoke to neighbors they were still on friendly terms with, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that night. A few sympathized with them, but most avoided them entirely, too intimidated by Emily's influence to share much. Sandra and her husband also made a list of details from Emily's accusations that just didn't add up. Emily claimed to have found the bracelet on their property after several days, yet her home security cameras, which she was known for bragging about, conveniently hadn't recorded anything suspicious. Then there was the inconsistency in her story about when she last wore the jewelry. It kept changing with every retelling, each version adding layers of confusion. Despite finding these small inconsistencies, the Johnsons faced an uphill battle. When they tried to share their findings with other neighbors, they were met with doubt and disbelief. Most brushed off their concerns, unwilling to consider that Emily, a long-standing figure in the neighborhood, could be lying. Frustration mounted as they realized that, despite their efforts, no one wanted to listen. Just as the Johnsons began to lose hope, an unexpected source of help came forward. Mrs. Thompson, an elderly neighbor who had lived in Maplewood Estates for decades, approached Sandra one morning while she was tending to her garden. Mrs. Thompson glanced around nervously, as if she feared being seen talking to Sandra. Finally, in a low voice, she said, "I don't like getting involved in neighborhood drama, dear. But there's something you should know about that night." Sandra's heart skipped a beat. "Please, Mrs. Thompson, anything you can tell us would help." Mrs. Thompson hesitated, her eyes shifting toward Emily's house before she continued, "I was out on my porch late that night. The night Emily says her jewelry disappeared. I saw her near her garden. She looked like she was hiding something in the bushes, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought maybe she was out for some fresh air or dealing with a stray cat." Sandra's pulse quickened. This was the first hint of something tangible, a sign that Emily might have been planting evidence herself. "Mrs. Thompson, that's exactly what we needed to hear." Sandra whispered gratefully. But Mrs. Thompson's face clouded with worry. I don't know, Sandra. Emily has a lot of power in this community. If I go against her, I'm afraid of what she might do. Well, let's just say she doesn't take kindly to anyone questioning her. Sandra nodded, understanding Mrs. Thompson's fear, but also realizing the importance of her testimony. I know it's a lot to ask, Sandra said gently, but if you could find the courage to speak up, it could mean everything to us. It could save our family. Mrs. Thompson looked down, her fingers fiddling with the edge of her shawl. I'll think about it, dear, she whispered. But promise me you won't tell anyone I spoke to you. Sandra promised, her heart lifted with a new sense of hope. Mrs. Thompson's words were like a light in the darkness, a chance that maybe, just maybe, the truth could finally begin to emerge. But they knew it would take even more courage and determination to convince Mrs. Thompson to speak up in court, and time was running out. As the trial date approached, Emily grew more desperate to destroy the Johnsons' reputation. Determined to ensure her victory in court, she hired a private investigator, an unassuming man with a sharp eye and a reputation for uncovering hidden secrets. She handed him the Johnsons' address and a wad of cash, instructing him to dig up anything he could. Financial troubles, past mistakes, even minor incidents she could spin into something bigger. For days, the PI followed the Johnsons, combing through public records, observing their routines, and interviewing anyone who'd give him a word. But try as he might, he found nothing incriminating. The Johnsons were an ordinary, hard-working family with a clean record. Frustrated, he returned to Emily, empty-handed. Emily, however, was unwilling to accept defeat. She began fabricating stories, mixing what little the investigator had gathered with her own malicious lies. She spread tales of how the Johnsons were secretly wealthy from scams in their past neighborhoods, claiming they moved around often to avoid suspicion. At community gatherings, she'd recount close calls the Johnsons supposedly had with the law in other towns, spinning the family's quiet, unassuming life into a fabricated history of deception. The rumors seeped into every corner of Maplewood Estates, leaving the Johnsons exhausted and on edge. Once again, they felt the suffocating weight of the lies pressing down on them. Despite their lawyer's reassurance, it was difficult to face the world with heads held high when they knew that Emily's lies were poisoning every conversation around them. At last, the day of the trial arrived. The Johnsons sat at their table, heads held high despite the toll Emily's campaign had taken on them. They wore simple, formal clothes and maintained a calm composure, determined to show the court their innocence and integrity. Marcus, their lawyer, gave them a reassuring nod as they prepared to face the storm. Across the room, Emily sat with her legal team, dressed in somber colors that added to her performance of a grieving victim. As the proceedings began, she took the stand, carefully dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and adjusting her voice to sound trembling and vulnerable. She painted herself as the victim of a calculated, malicious plot by a hostile and deceitful family who, in her words, had preyed upon her kindness and generosity. Emily recounted a series of fabricated stories, claiming the Johnsons had repeatedly intimidated her, sent her threatening messages, and even vandalized her property, all acts that never occurred. With each accusation, her voice quivered, drawing sympathetic looks from the jury and some members of the gallery. But the Johnsons held firm, refusing to respond to her provocations. When it was their turn to speak, they remained composed, speaking only when prompted and avoiding the temptation to react to Emily's dramatics. Marcus skillfully guided them through their testimony, ensuring they kept their responses clear and truthful, in stark contrast to Emily's exaggerated claims. As Emily continued her performance, Marcus watched closely, preparing his strategy. He knew the key to unraveling her story lay in patience and precision, waiting for the right moment to reveal the cracks in her fabricated tale. The Johnsons placed their trust in Marcus, knowing that his calm, calculated approach was the best hope they had for justice. The courtroom remained tense, divided between those who bought into Emily's theatrics and those who could see through her act. But the Johnsons knew that the trial had only just begun, and the truth still had a chance to make itself known. The tension in the courtroom thickened as Mrs. Thompson, a gentle woman in her 70s, took the stand. She clutched the edge of the witness stand, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced around the room. Her gaze landed on the Johnson family, and she offered them a faint, reassuring nod before she cleared her throat and began to speak. Mrs. Thompson testified to what she'd seen on the night of the alleged theft, her voice soft but resolute. "I was sitting on my porch late that night," she began, glancing nervously in Emily's direction. I saw Mrs. Patterson herself walking near the Johnsons' property line, and it looked like she was placing something in the bushes." A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and Emily's face turned an alarming shade of red. Mrs. Thompson continued, describing how strange Emily's behavior had seemed at the time, though she hadn't thought much of it until the accusations began circulating. Her testimony contradicted Emily's claims entirely, casting doubt on the entire story Emily had built. Emily's lawyer immediately jumped in, attempting to discredit Mrs. Thompson. He questioned her age, her memory, even her eyesight, suggesting she might have misinterpreted what she saw or misremembered the details. But Mrs. Thompson held her ground, determined to tell the truth. Her words painted a picture of Emily not as a victim but as someone capable of deceit. As the cross-examination continued, the courtroom grew silent, all eyes darting back and forth between Mrs. Thompson and Emily. With each calm answer Mrs. Thompson gave, the cracks in Emily's story began to widen, revealing glimpses of the truth beneath her lies. The tension in the courtroom grew even more palpable after Mrs. Thompson's testimony. Inspired by her courage, a few other neighbors, those who had once remained silent for fear of reprisal, decided to come forward as well. Each took the stand with their own account of events, painting an unsettling picture of Emily's past behavior. One by one, the neighbors shared their observations. Times when Emily had made exaggerated claims, pressured others into silence, or hinted at using her influence to take care of those who disagreed with her. They questioned her motives, sharing their suspicions about her sudden need for security after the Johnsons moved in and the odd hours she would lurk around the neighborhood. The testimonies pointed to a pattern, casting doubt on her character and motivations. As more neighbors came forward, Emily's carefully crafted image began to crumble. She watched, lips pursed, fists clenched, as her once steadfast supporters hesitated, questioning the truth behind her words. Panic flashed in her eyes, and, in a desperate bid to regain control, she lashed out in open court. "This is absurd," Emily shouted, her voice sharp and frantic. These people are all lying. They're trying to ruin me." The outburst caught the attention of everyone in the room. Emily's lawyer tried to calm her down, but she brushed him aside, her face flushed with fury. She pointed at the Johnsons, her finger trembling, as she continued her tirade, claiming they had somehow orchestrated this attack against her. But her true personality, manipulative, vindictive, and lacking empathy, was now fully exposed to the jury and the gallery. The calm, composed facade she had worn was gone, replaced by a raw anger that shocked those who had once trusted her. In that moment, Emily's mask slipped, and the courtroom saw her for who she truly was. The Johnsons exchanged a quiet, hopeful look, feeling for the first time that justice was within reach. With Emily's credibility in shambles, their lawyer, Marcus, prepared for the final phase of his strategy, to reveal the whole truth and set his clients free. Just as the trial seemed to reach a boiling point, Marcus, the Johnsons' lawyer, approached the bench with a new piece of evidence that caught everyone's attention. "Your Honor," he began with a confident tone, "we have recently acquired security footage from a neighbor's camera that recorded the events on the night in question. I request permission to play it for the court." The judge granted the request, and the room fell into an anticipatory silence. As the footage began to play, it showed a grainy yet clear view of Emily in her own backyard, moving stealthily under the cover of darkness. In the video, she crept toward the bushes that bordered the Johnsons' property. The court watched as she leaned down, her hand clearly placing something among the bushes before hurriedly retreating back to her house. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as everyone recognized what they were seeing. Proof that Emily herself had planted the bracelet, a key piece of her evidence against the Johnsons. Emily's face turned pale, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, looking around as if seeking an escape from the mounting judgment around her. With calm yet piercing words, Marcus addressed the courtroom. This footage clearly shows Mrs. Patterson near the Johnsons' property line on the very night she claims her jewelry was stolen. It's quite telling, don't you think? The jury members exchanged glances, their previous sympathy for Emily fading. Her entire story, once accepted by many as the truth, now appeared to be a calculated lie. The Johnsons remained composed, their spirits lifted by this crucial revelation. They could feel the tide turning, finally bringing light to the truth they had clung to all along. With the security footage fresh in everyone's minds, Emily was called to the stand to explain herself. She took her seat, visibly shaken, her eyes darting nervously between the judge, the jury, and Marcus, who stood with an unyielding gaze. The Johnsons' lawyer didn't waste time. "Mrs. Patterson," he began, his voice firm, "can you explain what you were doing near the Johnsons' property that night? Why were you seen placing an item in the bushes?" Emily fumbled, her usual confidence replaced with uncertainty. I don't know. Maybe I was just checking on something. There are so many stray animals around," she stammered, grasping for an excuse. But the courtroom was unconvinced. Her explanation was thin, transparent even, and the desperation in her voice was apparent. The judge leaned forward, his expression severe. "Mrs. Patterson, this court takes allegations of theft very seriously. You accuse this family of a crime, but this footage suggests something far different. I am beginning to question the validity of your accusations." Emily's lawyer attempted to intervene, but the judge silenced him with a wave of his hand. "I am ordering a recess," he declared, his tone indicating a new level of scrutiny directed at Emily. "This court needs time to review this new evidence and allow the defense to strengthen its case. Mrs. Patterson, you would do well to consider your next words carefully." With that, the courtroom was dismissed, and Emily was left trembling, her lies unraveling faster than she could contain them. The Johnsons gathered with Marcus, feeling a renewed sense of hope and relief. At last, they saw a clear path to justice, and they knew their lawyer was prepared to bring the truth fully to light when the trial resumed. When the court reconvened, Marcus, the Johnsons' lawyer, returned with another piece of evidence that would shift the trial's direction entirely. He presented financial records showing that Emily Patterson, despite her outwardly wealthy lifestyle, had been struggling financially for months. With mounting debts and overdue mortgage payments, she had faced the real possibility of losing her home. Marcus addressed the court, his tone steady and compelling. "Your Honor, the records before you indicate that Mrs. Patterson has been dealing with severe financial difficulties. These difficulties began long before the alleged theft and may shed light on her motives for these accusations." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as people processed this new information. Emily sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Marcus continued, weaving the pieces together in a calm, methodical way that left little room for doubt. "It is our belief," Marcus said, glancing briefly at the jury, "that Mrs. Patterson's accusations were not rooted in any criminal action on the Johnsons' part, but rather in a scheme to defraud her insurance company by claiming that her jewelry was stolen. This trial, this neighborhood drama, and the harm done to the Johnson family were all tactics to cover her intent to commit insurance fraud." Emily's lawyer quickly jumped up, attempting to redirect the narrative. "Your Honor, this is all speculative. My client's financial situation is personal and has no bearing on whether or not her jewelry was stolen." But Marcus was prepared. He presented documentation showing that Emily had filed an insurance claim shortly after the Johnsons moved in, citing her jewelry's sudden disappearance and claiming it was likely stolen. The claim, valued at a substantial amount, was filed just days before she first accused the Johnsons, painting a picture of a carefully timed setup. The judge examined the documents, his brow furrowed as he reviewed the timeline. He turned to Emily's lawyer, his expression stern. "It is highly unusual for someone to fabricate a crime to gain financially, and yet here we see both a motive and a sequence of events that suggest premeditation. This court is beginning to view these accusations with a different perspective." Emily's lawyer scrambled, his arguments faltering in the face of the mounting evidence. Meanwhile, the Johnsons sat quietly, watching as the truth finally emerged, vindicating them with each revelation. The insurance fraud theory was gaining traction, and Emily's house of lies was crumbling faster than she could salvage it. The courtroom could sense her desperation, and for the first time, Emily found herself on the defensive, with no excuses left to hide behind. As the trial continued, Marcus introduced another witness to the stand, someone who knew Emily well from her past, her former friend, Linda Myers. Linda, a reserved woman in her 50s, took the stand with a composed demeanor but a knowing glint in her eyes. She had been close friends with Emily years ago, before their friendship soured, and she'd seen a side of Emily that few others had. Marcus approached Linda and began questioning her about her history with Emily. Linda revealed that she had once been Emily's confidant, and as she recounted their past, she shared a troubling pattern. "This isn't the first time Emily has used accusations to get her way," Linda explained. "A few years back, she made similar claims against another neighbor who disagreed with her. She told everyone they'd vandalized her garden, but let's just say the evidence didn't add up." Linda went on to describe how Emily had a tendency to fabricate stories whenever she felt cornered or if she wanted something from someone. "She's a master manipulator," Linda stated, her tone firm. "She'll spin any story she needs to if it serves her interests. I've seen it happen time and again." The courtroom was captivated, hanging on every word. With Linda's testimony, the Johnsons' defense gained considerable strength. This wasn't a one-time incident, but rather a pattern of behavior, a trail of deception that cast Emily's current accusations in an even darker light. Emily squirmed in her seat, her face pale with fury. She glared at Linda, but the damage was done. Her past had come back to haunt her, and the jury was beginning to see her for who she truly was, a person who had long used lies to manipulate others. The Johnsons could feel the tide turning in their favor, their innocence finally shining through as Emily's web of deceit unraveled. As the trial continued, Marcus introduced another witness to the stand, someone who knew Emily well from her past, her former friend, Linda Myers. Linda, a reserved woman in her 50s, took the stand with a composed demeanor but a knowing glint in her eyes. She had been close friends with Emily years ago, before their friendship soured, and she'd seen a side of Emily that few others had. Marcus approached Linda and began questioning her about her history with Emily. Linda revealed that she had once been Emily's confidant, and as she recounted their past, she shared a troubling pattern. "This isn't the first time Emily has used accusations to get her way," Linda explained. "A few years back, she made similar claims against another neighbor who disagreed with her. She told everyone they'd vandalized her garden, but let's just say the evidence didn't add up." Linda went on to describe how Emily had a tendency to fabricate stories whenever she felt cornered or if she wanted something from someone. "She's a master manipulator," Linda stated, her tone firm. "She'll spin any story she needs to if it serves her interests. I've seen it happen time and again." The courtroom was captivated, hanging on every word. With Linda's testimony, the Johnsons' defense gained considerable strength. This wasn't a one-time incident, but rather a pattern of behavior, a trail of deception that cast Emily's current accusations in an even darker light. Emily squirmed in her seat, her face pale with fury. She glared at Linda, but the damage was done. Her past had come back to haunt her, and the jury was beginning to see her for who she truly was, a person who had long used lies to manipulate others. The Johnsons could feel the tide turning in their favor, their innocence finally shining through as Emily's web of deceit unraveled. As the case continued to crumble around her, Emily faced another devastating blow when her estranged husband, Richard Patterson, was called to the stand. Richard had been subpoenaed by Marcus, and while he had originally intended to support Emily, the weight of the evidence against her and their own fractured relationship forced him to reconsider his loyalty. Richard took the stand, his expression weary but resolute. Under questioning, he admitted to knowing about Emily's recent financial troubles. "Emily and I have been separated for some time," he began, glancing briefly at his wife, whose face showed a mix of shock and fury. "We faced significant financial issues before our separation. Emily was desperate to maintain her lifestyle, but she couldn't keep up with the expenses," Richard continued, his voice steady but firm. "I knew she was struggling and I suspected she might try to find a way to solve it herself. When I heard about the insurance claim, I had a feeling she might be planning something, but I didn't think she'd go this far. The courtroom was silent, every eye on Emily, whose carefully constructed facade was shattering piece by piece. Richard's testimony left no doubt that her accusations against the Johnsons were a calculated move, born of desperation and a willingness to harm others to protect her own interests. With her husband's damning words hanging in the air, Emily's last defense crumbled. She looked around the courtroom, eyes wild with desperation, as she realized there was no escape from the truth anymore. Her credibility was destroyed, and her carefully orchestrated scheme lay in tatters. The Johnsons sat quietly, relief and hope blossoming in their hearts as they saw justice inching closer, their nightmare finally nearing its end. The mounting evidence, the testimonies from past friends and her estranged husband, and the unrelenting scrutiny from the courtroom proved too much for Emily. She could feel her entire world closing in, each accusation stripping away the control she'd once had. Her hands shook as she gripped the edge of the table, her breathing becoming shallow and erratic. In a sudden, desperate attempt to salvage her case, Emily stood up, her voice rising to an almost frantic pitch. "This is all a setup," she shouted, pointing wildly at the Johnsons and even the judge. "They're all against me. The Johnsons, the neighbors. They've all conspired to make me look guilty." Gasps filled the room as Emily's composure unraveled completely. The calm, self-assured persona she'd maintained since the start was gone, replaced by a raw, unfiltered rage that left the jury and spectators stunned. Her face flushed with anger, and her words tumbled out in a furious stream as she accused everyone around her of betrayal, of turning against her for no reason. "None of this would have happened if they hadn't moved here," she continued, her voice cracking with fury. "They're the ones who don't belong here. They've poisoned this whole neighborhood." The courtroom sat in shocked silence, watching as Emily's true nature revealed itself, her entitlement and prejudice fully exposed. Even her own lawyer looked visibly distressed, realizing the damage her outburst had done. The jury, once swayed by her carefully crafted image, now saw the truth beneath, the vindictive, manipulative side she had hidden so well. Across the room, the Johnsons remained calm, watching Emily's meltdown with a quiet, composed dignity that only highlighted the difference between them. In that moment, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. The Johnsons, resilient and true, against a woman whose lies had finally consumed her. As the courtroom settled after Emily's explosive breakdown, Marcus, the Johnsons' lawyer, stood to deliver his closing statement. He took a moment, looking over the faces of the jury, each one visibly affected by the intense emotions and revelations that had surfaced during the trial. With a steady, empathetic tone, Marcus began, "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have heard from witnesses who have shown us that this case is more than just a simple accusation. We have seen the truth of Mrs. Patterson's intentions, her willingness to manipulate and deceive to achieve her ends, even if it meant tearing apart an innocent family in the process." He paused, his gaze turning toward the Johnsons, who sat quietly, holding each other's hands, calm and dignified. The Johnson family has endured humiliation, isolation, and emotional torment, all because of one person's desperate need to protect her own interests, no matter the cost. They have shown strength, integrity, and resilience throughout this ordeal, even as their lives were turned upside down by lies and prejudice. Marcus turned back to the jury, his voice growing firmer. "I urge you to look beyond the facade that Mrs. Patterson has presented. Look at the facts, the evidence, and the testimonies. Recognize the lengths to which she has gone to mislead this court and this community. Her accusations were not driven by truth, but by selfish motives and a desire to exploit the system for her own gain." He took a deep breath, allowing his words to sink in. "Today, you have the power to correct a grave injustice, to restore this family's good name, and to show that truth does prevail, even in the face of calculated lies. Let us not reward deceit. Let us instead honor honesty and integrity." As Marcus returned to his seat, the Johnsons exchanged a grateful glance, their hands clasped tightly in silent relief. They had weathered the storm with patience and dignity, standing united against the lies that had tried to tear them apart. The courtroom was left in a thoughtful hush, the jury reflecting on the striking contrast between Emily's shattered facade and the quiet strength of the family she had tried to destroy. As the jury exited the courtroom to begin deliberations, a heavy silence settled over the room. The Johnson family waited anxiously, their hands clasped together, bracing themselves for the outcome. Marcus leaned in and gave them a reassuring nod, but even he couldn't deny the tension that filled the air. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as they delivered live updates. The case had become a sensation, and the irony of Emily's accusations backfiring wasn't lost on anyone. Headlines painted a vivid picture of the ordeal. Wealthy woman schemed to frame innocent family exposed in courtroom meltdown. The story highlighted the complexities of the case and the courage of the Johnson family, who had fought not only to defend themselves but also to reveal the truth. Inside, the minutes felt like hours as the jury deliberated, each moment a test of patience and resilience. Neighbors who had once avoided the Johnsons now murmured words of support, shaken by Emily's shocking unraveling and the clear injustice that had taken place. For the Johnsons, it was a moment of vindication as they saw signs of redemption from a community that had nearly turned its back on them. Finally, the courtroom doors opened, and the jury filed back in, expressions grave but resolved. The Johnsons' hearts pounded as they prepared to hear the verdict, their future resting on the decision about to be made. The judge called the courtroom to order, his gaze steady as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson rose, clutching the paper that held the Johnsons' fate. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The courtroom held its breath as the foreperson read aloud. "In the case of Emily Patterson versus the Johnson family, we find the defendants not guilty." Relief flooded the Johnsons' faces, and they exchanged tearful hugs, their nightmare finally coming to an end. The gallery erupted in applause, a collective sense of justice and vindication filling the room as the truth triumphed over lies. The judge, waiting for the room to settle, then turned his attention to Emily, who sat in stunned silence, her composure entirely shattered. His tone stern, he addressed her directly. "Mrs. Patterson, this court does not take lightly the act of falsely accusing others, particularly when such accusations are used to exploit the legal system for personal gain." He continued, "The evidence presented has shown not only a clear intent to deceive, but a malicious willingness to harm innocent people in the process. This court is officially referring this case for further investigation, including charges of insurance fraud and perjury." Emily's face drained of color as she absorbed the weight of the judge's words. The once powerful and composed woman now appeared small and defeated, facing the very consequences she had tried to inflict on others. As the Johnsons left the courthouse, they were greeted by supportive applause from friends, neighbors, and even those who had once doubted them. Cameras flashed as they walked hand in hand, their dignity and strength a beacon to all who had followed their story. In the end, they had not only won their case but reclaimed their honor, standing tall as symbols of resilience against injustice. The Johnson family returned home to Maplewood Estates with a profound sense of relief and gratitude. After enduring months of false accusations, isolation, and fear, they could finally breathe freely, their nightmare officially over. Friends and family gathered to celebrate, filling the Johnsons' home with warmth and laughter. For the first time in what felt like ages, they felt safe. Word of the verdict spread quickly, and many neighbors, some who had initially sided with Emily, came by to offer apologies and support. Former critics, ashamed of having believed Emily's lies, expressed remorse, bringing small gifts and flowers as a gesture of goodwill. One by one, they told the Johnsons how Emily's manipulation had clouded their judgment, and though the Johnsons were cautious, they appreciated the gestures, choosing to forgive rather than dwell on past hurts. Later that evening, Marcus joined the celebration, sharing a toast with the Johnsons. "Now that we've cleared your name," he began, "we have an opportunity to make sure Emily is held accountable." He proposed filing a civil suit for damages, noting the emotional and financial toll her lies had inflicted on their lives. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson agreed. It wasn't about revenge, but rather about justice and setting a precedent against deceit. As they toasted to a fresh start, the Johnson family felt a renewed sense of strength. Their community, once tainted by mistrust, had turned back to embrace them, and with the pursuit of justice still ahead, they knew they'd continue to stand together, stronger than ever. Emily's once envied reputation in Maplewood Estates now lay in ruins. As her crimes came to light, both in court and in the media, she found herself shunned by the very people she'd once counted as friends. The story of her deceit spread, her carefully crafted image replaced by the reality of her lies and manipulation. The financial and legal consequences of her actions were swift and severe. With the judge's referral, authorities launched an investigation into her insurance fraud and perjury, piling additional charges onto her case. Her assets were frozen, and her debts only grew, leaving her in a financial bind she could no longer manipulate her way out of. Her plan to exploit the system for money had backfired spectacularly, leaving her in worse straits than ever before. Emily's former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to associate with someone who had tried to ruin an innocent family for personal gain. Social invitations vanished, and whispers about her disgrace spread through the community. Even her closest allies, those she'd once swayed to believe her lies, turned their backs, too embarrassed and appalled to continue their association. Alone and humiliated, Emily found herself facing a future defined by isolation and legal battles. Her once powerful influence had crumbled, leaving only the bitter reality of her actions. For the first time, she understood the price of her manipulation, but it was a lesson learned too late. Meanwhile, the Johnsons continued with their lives, strengthened by the support of those who had stood by them and by their unwavering belief in each other. Emily's downfall served as a reminder to the entire community about the cost of dishonesty and prejudice, and the unbreakable strength of those who stand for the truth. Emily Patterson's life, once marked by privilege and influence, spiraled rapidly out of control. With her assets frozen, mounting legal bills, and the possibility of jail time looming, she could no longer rely on her wealth or her status to shield her. The privileges she'd taken for granted had evaporated, replaced by the harsh reality of the consequences she now faced. Her once grand home became eerily quiet as friends and allies abandoned her, unwilling to associate with someone whose crimes had shattered the community's trust. Emily's calls went unanswered, her invitations ignored, and the silence of her isolation weighed heavily. Desperation finally drove her to attempt reaching out to the Johnson family. Perhaps an apology, however belated, could ease her conscience and save what little remained of her dignity. But when Emily contacted their lawyer to arrange a meeting, the Johnsons declined. They had no desire to revisit the pain she'd caused, nor did they feel her apology could undo the damage. The memories of her lies and the trauma her actions inflicted were too fresh, too deep to be softened by words. She had inflicted a scar on their lives that couldn't be erased with mere remorse. For Emily, the rejection was a devastating blow. Left alone to face her downfall, she began to understand, too late, the gravity of her actions and the irreversible consequences of her choices. Her privileged life had unraveled, leaving her with nothing but the bitter taste of regret. With the ordeal behind them, the Johnson family could finally focus on moving forward. They poured their energy into rebuilding their lives, both within their home and in the neighborhood that had once turned its back on them. Marcus remained a close friend and confidant, supporting them as they navigated their fresh start and began to find peace again. The Johnsons' strength and resilience throughout the trial had earned them the admiration of their neighbors. Those who had once doubted them now sought to support them, offering friendship and extending invitations to community events. Slowly, the Johnsons accepted, choosing to welcome these new bonds and heal the divisions Emily's lies had created. They worked to restore their reputation and, in the process, reconnected with the neighborhood in ways they hadn't expected. Their courage became an inspiration, a story of resilience in the face of injustice. Mr. Johnson joined the neighborhood council, sharing his experiences to foster understanding and prevent similar incidents in the future, while Sandra volunteered at the local community center, helping newcomers feel welcome. Jamal, too, found a renewed confidence, surrounded by supportive friends who stood by him. He'd grown stronger, learning firsthand the value of integrity and compassion, lessons he'd carry with him into adulthood. For the Johnson family, the dark days were finally behind them. With every small victory, every act of kindness, they reclaimed their peace and happiness, standing tall as respected members of their community. Their journey had been difficult, but in the end, they had proven the power of truth, courage, and the unwavering strength of family. Emily sat alone in her empty house, the once bustling life around her reduced to silence. The consequences of her actions had finally settled in, stripping away every trace of the status and privilege she had once wielded with ease. Friends, allies, her social circle, all gone. She was left with nothing but the bitter reality of her own choices. Isolated and shunned by the very community she had once influenced, Emily was forced to confront the depth of her prejudice and the lies that had fueled her actions. For the first time, she saw the ugliness of her behavior, the impact her manipulations had had on an innocent family. Her attempts to regain control and shield her own reputation had instead destroyed it, leaving her forever marked by the disgrace of her actions. Night after night, Emily lay awake, haunted by the hurt she'd inflicted, her regret overwhelming. In her mind, she replayed each lie, each manipulation, each attempt to turn the community against the Johnsons. She realized too late that her prejudice had been the driving force behind her actions, a force she could no longer deny or ignore. She had sacrificed not only her standing in the community, but also her own integrity, and the weight of that realization would follow her for the rest of her days. For the Johnson family, life gradually returned to a new, brighter normal. The neighborhood now embraced them with warmth and respect, the pain of their ordeal giving way to healing and a renewed sense of purpose. Relieved and finally at peace, the Johnsons began looking to the future, their bond stronger than ever. With encouragement from Marcus, they decided to channel their experiences into something meaningful. They became advocates for justice, using their story to raise awareness about the dangers of prejudice, false accusations, and manipulation. The Johnsons spoke at community gatherings and local schools, sharing their journey to inspire others to stand up against injustice and to seek truth and fairness. Their efforts created a ripple effect in the community and beyond. Mr. Johnson worked closely with neighborhood leaders to foster inclusivity and understanding, helping to create policies that would prevent others from experiencing the hardship they had endured. Sandra led support groups for families who had faced similar accusations, offering a space for healing and solidarity. Jamal, now stronger and wiser, shared his story with peers, determined to turn his pain into a lesson of resilience and compassion. The Johnsons' legacy grew, transforming their experience into a beacon of hope for those facing discrimination and wrongful accusations. They had taken what could have been a devastating chapter and turned it into a powerful testimony, leaving a lasting impact on those around them. In the end, the Johnson family proved that, even in the face of the harshest trials, dignity, truth, and unity could lead to triumph. They had overcome, and in doing so, they had found not only peace but also a purpose that would inspire others for generations to come.
I hope you enjoyed the story. Please like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Thank you.